In January 1345, the two most powerful banks in the world ceased to exist, not because of bad investments, not because of a market crash, not because of anything the banks themselves did wrong. They were destroyed by a single decision made by a single man, sitting on a throne in London. A king who had borrowed 1.5 million gold florins. A king who had pledged his kingdom's wool revenues, his customs duties, his tax collection rights. A king who had handed the Bardi and Peruzzi families the keys to the English treasury in exchange for the money to fight a war. And then, when the war did not go as planned, when the quick victory he had promised them did not arrive, he simply stopped paying. 900,000 gold florins owed to the Bardi, 600,000 to the Peruzzi. None of it ever repaid. The Peruzzi collapsed first. 1343. The Bardi held on for 2 more years, then suspended payments in January 1345, and never reopened. Within 18 months, 3 of the 4 largest banking houses in Europe were gone. The private savings of wealthy families across Italy vanished with them. A financial architecture that had funded the Crusades, served the papacy, and connected the economies of England, France, and Florence, dissolved inside a single decade. And the man who caused it paid nothing, not 1 florin, not 1 shilling, went on to win military victories, to be celebrated in England as a warrior king, to found the Order of the Garter. He outlived the banks he destroyed by 30 years. Here is the part nobody tells you. The Bardi and Peruzzi were not naive lenders. They were not tricked. They were the most sophisticated financial operators in the medieval world. They understood sovereign risk. They had survived wars, famines, papal politics, and currency crises for over a century. And they still lost everything, because the mechanism that destroyed them was not incompetence. It was structural. What was built into the relationship from the first moment they agreed to lend. This channel is the money architect, and what you are about to see is not a medieval story. It is the oldest story in the history of money, and it is still happening right now. What does it tell you that the most sophisticated banks in the world in 1345 made the same mistake that brought down Lehman Brothers in 2008? Leave your answer below. To understand what happened in 1345, you need to understand what the Bardi and Peruzzi actually were. Because most people picture medieval banks as something small. Money changer behind a wooden counter. A ledger book. A strong box. That is not what these were. By 1310, the Compagnia dei Bardi was the wealthiest private institution in Florence, possibly in all of Europe. They did not just lend money. They collected papal revenues across the continent and transmitted them to Rome. They held deposits from noble families, abbeys, and merchant houses from London to Naples. They ran commodity trading operations in grain, wool, and cloth on a scale that no individual merchant could match. They financed the English crown's household expenses. They were, in the language of our own time, systemically important, too big to fail. Except nobody had invented that phrase yet. The Peruzzi were their closest rivals and frequent partners in risk. By the early 14th century, the two families together controlled credit flows across most of Western Europe. When the papacy needed money moved from England to Avignon. It went through them. When a king needed to pay an army in Flanders, it went through them. They were the infrastructure of medieval finance, not a part of the system itself. And there is a problem with being the system. When you are the system, powerful people do not ask you for loans. They tell you that you will provide them. They offer you things in return: wool licenses, trading concessions, tax collection rights, that you cannot refuse without destroying your own business. The relationship is never between equals. It never was. Edward III understood this perfectly. He came to the throne in 1327 at the age of 14, and he watched his father's reign collapse, in part because of financial mismanagement. He was not going to repeat that mistake. When he decided to press his claim to the French throne in the mid-1330s, he did not approach the Bardi and Peruzzi as a supplicant. He approached them as a king, as the controller of the English wool trade, as the man who could grant or revoke the licenses that made their English operations profitable. You need to understand what English wool meant in 1337. It was not a commodity. It was the oil of the medieval economy. The textile industries of Florence, Bruges, and Ghent ran on it. Without English wool, the looms stopped. Without the looms, the merchants lost their margins. Without the margins, the banks lost their clients. Edward III held that lever, and he pulled it. In 1337, he entered into an agreement with a syndicate of wool merchants, placed an embargo on exports, and used the manufactured scarcity to force the terms he needed. The Bardi and Peruzzi were already inside that system. They had no clean exit, and so the borrowing began. £82,000 between September 1336 and December 1337 alone. That was just the opening position. The scale of what came next is where the story changes entirely. Here is what most people miss about the Bardi and Peruzzi loans. The numbers that historians quote: 900,000 florins to the Bardi, 600,000 to the Peruzzi, are not simply the amounts Edward borrowed. They include something else. Something that the Church of the 14th century did not permit anyone to name out loud. Interest. Usury was a sin. It was defined as such in Scripture and enforced by canon law. You could not charge interest on a loan. Not to a king, not to a peasant, not to anyone. But you could charge for delays in repayment. You could accept gifts as tokens of royal gratitude. You could receive compensation for losses incurred while waiting. And so the banks and the crown had built an entire architecture of legal fiction. The interest was real. The rate varied between 15% in stable times and 40% during war. But none of it was called interest. All of it was called something else. Scholars who examined the actual records found that roughly 2/3 of Edward's total stated debt represented these disguised charges. Not principal, not money that Edward had actually received and spent on soldiers and ships. Accumulated promises of payment dressed in the language of royal generosity. This matters enormously because it means the banks were not just owed repayment. They were owed a fiction that had grown so large it could no longer be maintained. When Edward stopped paying, he was not simply refusing to return money he had borrowed. He was refusing to honor a shadow ledger that neither party had ever been able to name honestly. But it gets worse. The collateral Edward offered was not gold. It was not land. It was flow. The future revenues of the English wool trade. The customs duties collected at the ports. The taxes that Parliament had granted to the Crown. Edward assigned these revenue streams directly to Bardi and Peruzzi agents, who collected them at the source. For a period of years, the banks effectively ran the English customs system. They sat at the ports. They counted the sacks. They took their cut before the money ever reached the royal treasury. This arrangement had a name in our time. It is called a debt trap. You borrow against future revenue. The creditor takes control of that revenue to service the debt. The borrower loses the income stream that would allow him to repay. The debt compounds. The control deepens. The exit becomes impossible. Edward had handed the Bardi and Peruzzi the mechanism of his own financial sovereignty. And he had done it voluntarily, because the alternative was arriving in France without an army. By 1340, the Bardi were supplying him with their own wool because the parliamentary grants of wool he had promised them could not be delivered fast enough. By 1343 it was clear the war was not going to end quickly. The alliance Edward had built with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Flemish cities was fracturing. The costs were compounding, and the king who had promised the banks a short, profitable war was looking at a conflict that would eventually run for over 100 years. He made a calculation. The banks were foreign. They were Florentine. They were already unpopular in England, resented for their privileged access to royal revenues and trading concessions. A king who repudiated debts to Italian bankers would face no domestic political consequence. None. The English Parliament would not weep for the Bardi. The English people would not march in the streets for the Peruzzi. And so he stopped paying. What that decision triggered was not just the failure of two banks. It was the first modern sovereign debt crisis in European history. And it followed a pattern that you will recognize. The collapse did not happen all at once. That is the first thing you need to understand. Systems fail slowly, then suddenly. But Bardi and Peruzzi did not walk into a single catastrophic moment. They walked into it over years, each step appearing manageable, each quarter loss appearing temporary, each royal promise appearing credible just long enough to prevent the panic that would have ended things sooner. The Peruzzi broke first. In 1343, their depositors began to understand that the money was gone, not misplaced, not delayed, gone, committed to a king who was not going to return it. The bank that had served the papacy, that had held the savings of merchants and nobles across the Italian peninsula, that had operated for nearly a century as one of the foundational institutions of European commerce, was bankrupt. Its creditors lined up. The assets were insufficient. The depositors took their losses. The chronicler Giovanni Villani watched it happen from inside Florence. He was not a distant observer. He was a merchant, a city official, a man whose own financial world was trembling. I recorded Edward's debt to the Bardi as 900,000 florins and to the Peruzzi as 600,000. Called it ruin, not misfortune, not bad luck. ruin. He understood what it meant for the city. Pay attention to this number. Florence, in 1343, was a city of approximately 90,000 people. It was one of the 5 largest cities in Europe. Its prosperity rested, more than any other city on the continent, on the financial sector. The super companies were not peripheral to Florentine life. They were the reason Florence was Florence. Their depositors were the merchant class. Their employees were thousands of Florentine families. When the Peruzzi collapsed in 1343, and the Bardi followed across 1345 and 1346, the economic damage did not stay inside the banking sector. It moved through the entire city like a current. Acciaioli, the 3rd largest Florentine banking house, collapsed in 1345. They had not lent significantly to Edward. It did not matter. Contagion does not ask for the specific cause of your failure. It only requires that confidence is gone and that everyone moves toward the exit at the same time. And then, 3 years after the Bardi suspended payments, in the summer of 1348, the Black Death arrived in Florence. The city that had already lost its financial foundations now lost half its population. Giovanni Villani was among those who died. His chronicle of Florentine history ends mid-sentence, and he was writing when the plague took him. The sentence was never finished. What the sequence of 1343 to 1348 produced was not just a depression. It was the destruction of an entire civilizational model. The super companies, the vast, vertically integrated banking and trading conglomerates that had dominated European finance for over a century, were gone. Every one of them. The institutional memory, the client relationships, the credit networks, the accumulated expertise of generations, erased. The power vacuum did not stay empty. It never does. The Medici, the Strozzi, the Pazzi, the Rucellai. Smaller, more careful, more politically connected. They moved into the space left by the destroyed giants. Cosimo de' Medici, operating from the 1420s onward, built the most influential banking dynasty in Renaissance history on ground that the Bardi and Peruzzi had cleared with their own destruction. The Renaissance was financed by the survivors of the catastrophe Edward III created. That is not a poetic observation. That is a financial fact, and the pattern those events established: sovereign borrowing, structural dependency, political repudiation, systemic collapse, did not stay in the 14th century. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. 158 years of operation. Not $613 billion in liabilities. Gone in a single morning. The proximate cause was different from 1345. The instruments were different. The geography was different. But the structure was identical. A borrower too large to be refused. Loans secured against revenues that proved insufficient. A financial institution whose exposure to one category of counterparty had grown concentrated, that when those counterparties stopped performing, there was nothing left. The bank had become dependent on the health of the very entity that destroyed it. This is the pattern. It does not change. Only the names change. You have seen it in sovereign debt crises across the 20th century. Argentina defaulted 8 times between 1827 and 2020. Each time, the banks that held its debt absorbed losses. Each time, the institutional creditors, the foreign banks, the bondholders, the IMF facilities, took the damage while the sovereign government restructured, renegotiated, and continued. Greece in 2012, Russia in 1998, Mexico in 1982. The form varies. The mechanism is constant. The sovereign borrows. The sovereign struggles. The sovereign repudiates or restructures. The creditor pays. And here is what is genuinely uncomfortable about this. The banks always know. They knew in 1337 that lending to a king at war was dangerous. The Bardi and Peruzzi had watched other institutions take sovereign losses. They had the data. They had the history. They lent anyway, because the alternative, refusing the king his money, would have cost them their English wool licenses, their customs access, their trading concessions. The relationship had become coercive. Long before the first florin crossed the Channel, Lehman Brothers knew the mortgage-backed securities market was deteriorating. In 2006 and 2007, the internal communications made this clear afterward. They continued because the exits were all costly, because the short-term revenues from continuing outweighed the long-term losses from stopping, because the institution had grown so dependent on one revenue stream that unwinding it felt more dangerous than extending it. The Bardi looked fine in 1341, still making loans, still taking deposits, still operating branches across Europe. The cracks were internal. The exposure was invisible to everyone, except the men running the books. And those men had every incentive to believe that the king would eventually pay, that the war would turn, that the next season would be different. It was not different. The other institution you need to understand here is not a bank. It is the English Parliament. In 1340, Edward III was forced to return to England and account for his spending. Parliament did not object to the debt itself. It objected to the terms. The fact that foreign bankers had been given control of English customs revenues, to the principle that Italian merchants were effectively running the king's finances from counting houses in London and Florence. Parliament expressed that objection. Edward noted it, and then used it. When the time came to repudiate, parliamentary sentiment was already prepared. The English public had been primed to see the Bardi and Peruzzi not as creditors owed repayment, but as foreign operators who had extracted too much already. The political conditions for default had been cultivated years in advance, not by accident, by design. That is not medieval. That is the template. Here is the question that the standard history never asks. Why did the Bardi and Peruzzi lend in the first place? Not the mechanical answer. The wool licenses, the trading concessions, the fear of losing their English operations. The deeper answer, the structural one. They lent because the system required them to. Medieval banking in the 14th century operated on a fundamental contradiction. The banks needed sovereign clients to achieve the scale that made them powerful. A bank that lent only to merchants and abbeys would never become a super company. Only royal debt was large enough, prestigious enough, and connected enough to other revenues and relationships to justify the infrastructure the Bardi and Peruzzi had built. They needed kings, and kings, understanding this, extracted maximum advantage from the need. The same contradiction sits at the heart of modern banking. Large financial institutions require large borrowers. Large borrowers are, almost by definition, entities whose failure would be politically catastrophic. When those borrowers struggle, the institutions face a choice that is not really a choice. Continue lending and risk the gradual loss of the Bardi. Stop lending and trigger the immediate crisis of the Peruzzi. Either path leads out. The institution is trapped by its own size. This is why the answer is not simply don't to lend to kings. That lesson, while true, is insufficient. The banks of the 14th century could not stop lending to Edward any more than the banks of 2007 could stop buying mortgage-backed securities. The market structure made the dangerous asset the necessary asset. Withdrawal meant irrelevance, and irrelevance, for a bank operating at that scale, meant collapse just as surely as a default. The people who benefit from this arrangement are not the banks. They are not the depositors who lose their savings when the super company fails. They are the sovereigns, the governments, the entities large enough to borrow at systemic scale, politically insulated enough to repudiate without domestic consequence, and durable enough to outlive the institutions they destroy. Edward III did not invent sovereign default. Neplasekmen defaulted 4 times between 1557 and 1596, destroying the Genoese banking houses that financed his empire. The French crown defaulted repeatedly across the 17th and 18th centuries. Each time, the private creditors absorbed the losses. Each time, the sovereign restructured, reappeared in the capital markets, and found new banks willing to lend because the alternative, refusing, was worse. The Peruzzi family understood this eventually. 500 years later, in 1830, a descendant of that banking house arrived in London carrying a document, a bill, an invoice presented to the Lord Mayor of London for the estimated interest still outstanding on Edward III's original loan from 1337. The interest that had never been paid, the debt that had never been settled, the claim that no court in any century had ever enforced. It was not paid in 1830 either. It had not been paid since. You are not the Bardi. You are not the Peruzzi. You do not have branches in London and Naples and Avignon. You do not hold the papal revenues of 3 countries, or the customs receipts of a king. But you are a depositor. You always have been. Every savings account, every pension fund, every government bond in your portfolio is a version of the same arrangement. You have extended credit to an institution. That institution has extended it onward to borrowers larger than itself. Some of those borrowers are governments. Some are entities whose failure would be described, in the careful language of central bankers, as systemic. You are at the end of a chain that begins with your money and ends with the decisions of people you will never meet and cannot hold accountable. The depositors of the Bardi and Peruzzi did not make bad decisions. They placed their money with the most stable, most prestigious, most politically connected financial institutions in the world. They did everything right, and they lost everything, not because of their choices, because of choices made by a king in London who calculated that he could afford the political cost of default and decided that the foreign bankers would absorb it, so that he did not have to. That calculation, that the cost of default can be exported to creditors, to depositors, to foreign institutions, to future generations, is the calculation that every sovereign in history has made when the debt became unsustainable. It is being made right now in governments that carry a debt loads that the mathematics says cannot be repaid on any realistic timeline. The question is not whether you understand this mechanism in the abstract. The question is whether you have positioned yourself to not be the Florentine depositor in 1343. Whether your savings are exposed to the same concentration risk that destroyed the super companies. Whether the institutions holding your money are holding too much of one kind of sovereign promise. The answer to that question is the most important financial question you will ask this year. In January 1345, the Bardi suspended payments and never reopened. Edward III went on to win the Battle of Crecy the following year. He founded the Order of the Garter in 1348, was celebrated. He was commemorated. He outlived the institutions he destroyed by 3 decades and died a king. The Peruzzi family sent a bill to London in 1830, nearly 500 years after the default. The estimated interest on a debt that was never settled, never enforced, never acknowledged by any English court in any century. It was presented to the Lord Mayor of London with complete seriousness. The Lord Mayor did not pay it. The debt was never settled. It never is. This is what the Bardi and Peruzzi story actually tells you. Not that you should never lend to kings. That lesson, while true, is too simple. It tells you that when an institution becomes structurally dependent on a borrower too large to refuse, the default is not a risk. It is a schedule. It tells you that the political conditions for repudiation are built years before the repudiation happens. In parliamentary sentiment, in public opinion, in the careful cultivation of resentment toward the creditor. It tells you that the depositors, the savers, the ordinary people who placed their trust in the most respected institutions of their age, are always the last to know and always the first to lose. Edward III's story is not in a history book. The mechanism is in this morning financial news, in the debt ceilings and restructuring negotiations and sovereign credit ratings of the world right now. The names are different. The sums are larger. The legal architecture is more elaborate. But the king is still borrowing. The banks are still lending. And somewhere the calculation is being made. History does not repeat. But if you do not understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this is the first time you have heard the names Bardi and Peruzzi, subscribe, because every video on this channel is the same story in a different century.